It was a cold September night in 2016, and I was deep in the woods of Washington State, sitting inside a damp tent, listening to the endless sound of rain hitting the thin fabric above me. The water dripped from the edge of the tarp I had set up earlier in the evening, forming steady little streams that ran into the mud around my boots. My job was simple: overnight security for a construction site that was set up in the middle of nowhere. The company had been clearing land for a new road through the forest, and they had left expensive equipment behind: generators, fuel, heavy machinery, tools. I was there to make sure no one came poking around in the dark. I had done security work before, but usually at stores or offices. This was different. Out here, there were no cameras, no backup, no streetlights. Just me, my flashlight, and the old shotgun the company had provided. The rain had started around sundown, and by midnight, it had turned into a full storm. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches groan and sway. Every few minutes, something heavy would crash in the distance. A falling tree limb, maybe, or just the weight of the rain pushing something loose. I sat on my folding chair, the shotgun leaning against my leg, and stared out into the darkness. The work site itself was just a cleared-out patch of land with a couple of unfinished dirt roads leading off into the woods. There were 2 large bulldozers, a backhoe, a half-built foundation for what would eventually be a bridge, and a small supply shed that was locked up with a heavy chain. The only shelter I had was my tent, set up on the driest patch of ground I could find. My shift was supposed to last until 6 a.m. No one was supposed to come out here until then, and there was no reason for anyone to be out in these woods at this hour. So when I saw a light moving through the trees just past the work site, I froze. It was faint, barely visible through the rain and mist, but it was definitely there. A flashlight swinging back and forth. Someone walking. I reached for my shotgun and stood up slowly, my boots sinking into the mud. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe slow. I didn't want to panic. There were a dozen possible explanations. Maybe it was one of the workers who forgot something, maybe it was a lost hiker, maybe even a game warden checking the area. But none of those made sense. Not at this hour. I moved carefully toward the edge of the work site, keeping low, my eyes locked on the light. It was moving in a straight line, slow and steady, like someone was deliberately searching for something. It wasn't flickering or bouncing like a hiker's light would. Whoever was holding it was walking with purpose. I gripped the shotgun tighter. Then the light stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. The rain pounded against my jacket, ran down my face, soaked my clothes, but I didn't move. The flashlight just hung there in the darkness, completely still. I couldn't see who was holding it, but I knew they were watching the site, watching me. Then, slowly, the light turned off. I held my breath. The darkness swallowed everything. The rain masked any sound they might have made, and that was the worst part. I couldn't hear footsteps, couldn't hear movement. Whoever it was, they were still out there, hidden in the trees, waiting. I backed up slowly toward my tent. My radio was inside, along with my phone. I hadn't thought to bring either with me when I stepped out. I cursed myself under my breath. I had to get to them. I took another step back, and my boot hit something solid. I spun, shotgun raised, but there was nothing there. Just the backhoe looming in the dark like a dead thing. My nerves were shot, my body tight with adrenaline. I took a shaky breath and hurried into my tent, fumbling for the radio. I clicked it on. "Base, this is security. Do you copy?" Static. I tried again. "Base, come in." Nothing. The storm must have been messing with the signal. I grabbed my phone, my hands still slick with rain, and checked for service. No bars. Of course. Out here, I was completely cut off. I sat there in the tent, shotgun across my lap, staring at the darkness beyond the open flap. I thought about packing up, getting in my truck, and just leaving. But that would mean walking all the way back across the site, past the trees where the light had been. I stayed put. The next hour was pure hell. The rain kept falling, the wind kept howling, but I didn't see the light again. No movement, no sound. I started to think maybe whoever it was had left. Maybe they were just some lost camper or some dumb kid screwing around. But then I heard it. A sound just outside the tent. Not footsteps. Breathing. Slow. Shaky. Someone standing just inches away from the fabric, just standing there. Listening. I stopped breathing. For a long moment, nothing happened. The rain drowned out everything else. But I knew. Asterisk, asterisk, I knew asterisk, asterisk. Someone was there. I moved as slowly as I could, gripping the shotgun, bringing it up. I wasn't going to call out. I wasn't going to ask who they were. I wasn't going to give them a warning. Then the tent collapsed. Something heavy hit the side, knocking it in, pressing the fabric against me. I exploded out of the other side, tearing through the thin material, slipping in the mud, the shotgun gripped tight in my hands. I spun, heart hammering, but there was no one there, just the tent, half crushed, flattened into the ground. I backed up toward the supply shed, scanning the darkness. Whoever it was, they had been right there, right on top of me, and they were still out there. I didn't wait. I ran for my truck. I didn't care if it meant turning my back to the trees. I didn't stop. My boots slid in the mud. My breath came in ragged gasps, and every nerve in my body screamed that I was about to feel hands grabbing me from behind. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. Locked it, started the engine. The headlights flared to life, cutting through the storm. And in that light, I saw him, standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the branches. Tall, thin, clothes soaked through. His face was shadowed, but I could see the outline of him, just standing there, watching. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I threw the truck in reverse, spun it around, and tore out of there, fishtailing through the mud. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement, until I saw lights, until I was miles away. I called my boss once I had service, told him I was done. I didn't care if I lost the job. I wasn't going back. The cops went out there the next day. They found my tent, ripped open, footprints in the mud, leading from the trees. No sign of anyone. Whoever he was gone. But I know he was real, and I know he's still out there. I don't know how many people have ever been truly hunted by something in the woods. I don't mean chased by a bear, stalked by a mountain lion, or even just lost in the trees feeling paranoid. I mean something watching you, following your every move, studying you like you're the only thing in its world. If you've never felt it, it's hard to explain. But once it happens, you know in your bones, and it never leaves you. This happened to me in the fall of 2006, deep in the Colorado backcountry. I was 34 at the time. I'd been hunting solo for years and had done plenty of week-long solo trips. I was comfortable in the woods, comfortable with being alone. I liked the silence, the long hikes, the early mornings, and the feeling of being completely self-sufficient. I wasn't some amateur. I packed in about 6 miles from the nearest dirt road, heading into a valley where I'd scouted elk the previous season. I carried my rifle, a .308 Winchester, along with my pack, tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food for a week, the usual. I planned to set up camp near a creek I had marked on my map and then hunt up in the higher elevations where the elk would be feeding. It was the second evening when I first noticed it. I'd spent the day tracking, moving slowly up a ridgeline, stopping every so often to glass the tree line. I didn't see much, some old sign, nothing fresh, but I wasn't worried. The weather was good, and I had time. I started back down toward camp in the late afternoon, moving slow and quiet, just enjoying being out there. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't mine. They weren't fresh, but they were deep, pressed into the damp earth where the shadows of the trees kept the ground from drying. They were spaced evenly, deliberately, not the erratic path of an animal moving through undergrowth, not the big round imprints of a bear. And they were too large to be any of the other usual suspects: coyote, deer, mountain lion. They looked like boot prints. I knelt down, running my fingers over the edges of the impressions. They were old, at least a day, maybe more, but something about them made me feel uneasy. They were headed in the same direction I'd come from. I stood up, looking back the way I had come. Nothing but trees, golden light filtering through the aspens. The wind was still, the forest silent except for the occasional creak of a branch. I told myself it was another hunter, maybe someone passing through, maybe someone who had camped out here and moved on. There was no rule saying I had to be the only one in this stretch of woods. Still, I picked up the pace. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was setting. I got a fire going, cooked up some freeze-dried beef stew, and tried to shake the weird feeling I'd had. I reminded myself I'd be fine. I had my rifle. I had my knife. I'd spent more nights alone in the woods than I could count. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I kept waking up, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was filtering through the fabric of my tent. I unzipped the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. I stretched, then turned toward the fire pit, and stopped. There were footprints in the dirt. Fresh, not mine. They circled my tent. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to move, to step closer. The tracks were clear, precise. Someone had walked right up to my tent while I was sleeping, stood there, watched me, then walked away. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The forest was still, but my skin crawled like I was being watched. I crouched down, touching one of the prints. The edges were crisp. It had been made recently, hours ago at most. I reached for my rifle. I wasn't staying here. I packed up fast, stuffing my gear into my pack, killing the fire, double-checking that I had everything. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. A lost hiker? No, a hiker would have called out. Another hunter? No, a hunter wouldn't just walk into someone's camp without announcing themselves. Whoever it was, they hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't taken my food, my gear. They hadn't left a note. They had just stood there, watching. I left camp behind, heading for higher ground, moving fast but careful. I wanted to get a better vantage point to see if I could spot anything from above. I hiked hard for 2 hours before stopping on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. But that didn't mean they weren't there. By midday, I had a plan. I wasn't going to stick around another night. I would hike out, make it back to my truck by nightfall. I started down, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a tree, just a dark shape among the branches. But then it moved, a figure half hidden in the trees, standing completely still. Watching me, I froze. He was too far to make out details, but I could see enough. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I raised my rifle, not aiming, just letting him know I saw him. He didn't move. I backed away slowly, then turned and started down the trail, keeping my pace steady. Not running, not yet. I glanced back once. He was gone. I didn't stop moving. I hiked hard, pushing myself, ignoring the burning in my legs, the sweat running down my back. My only thought was getting back to the truck. The sun dipped low. The light faded. The woods closed in around me. I didn't look back again. When I reached my truck, I didn't stop to breathe. I threw my gear in, locked the doors, and peeled out down that dirt road faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles away, parked outside a gas station, hands shaking on the wheel. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he was out there. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night. But I know this: something was watching me in those woods, and it wasn't just passing through. I've always liked the quiet of camping alone. There's something peaceful about it, the way the world slows down when you're by yourself in nature. So, when I found a small, off-the-beaten-path graveyard nestled in a quiet corner of the woods, it seemed like the perfect place for a solo camping trip. I wasn't expecting much, just a few days to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life, clear my head, and enjoy the silence. The graveyard was old, forgotten by most people. It wasn't a place you'd find in any tourist guides. I'd stumbled upon it during a hike a few months ago, and I'd been thinking about coming back ever since. The weather was nice when I finally set out, the air cool but not too chilly. It was early October, just before the leaves started turning, and the sun was high when I reached my destination. The graveyard was barely noticeable, just a few weathered stones scattered under a canopy of trees. I set up camp at the edge of the graveyard, just far enough that I didn't feel like I was intruding, but close enough that I could see the crumbling headstones through the trees. It wasn't a big graveyard, just a handful of graves, mostly unmarked or too old to read. The air felt heavy, like it was holding on to the past, but there was nothing overtly sinister about it. In fact, it had a certain charm. The overgrown grass, the vines curling around the stones, and the smell of earth and fallen leaves gave it a natural, organic feel. I built a fire, got comfortable by the edge of the campsite, and began to cook my dinner. The night was coming on fast, and the temperature dropped. As the sun disappeared, the sounds of the forest grew louder: crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. I had a book to pass the time, and as I sat there, the crackling of the fire was the only sound that kept me company. But something felt off. It was subtle, like a feeling in the back of your mind when you're being watched. At first, I tried to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks, but the feeling didn't go away. Every time I glanced up from my book, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Nothing specific, just shadows, shapes shifting in the dark between the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, the way branches swayed, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the fire flickered. I couldn't see very far into the graveyard at night, but I swear I saw one of the gravestones shift. It was as if it had moved slightly, like it was leaning toward me. I blinked and looked away, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But then there was another movement. A stone, a small one, rolling a little, shifting, like something had touched it. My heart started to beat faster. I knew I should have been scared, but I wasn't sure what I was scared of. It wasn't ghosts or anything ridiculous like that. I didn't believe in that stuff. But there was something about this place, this quiet graveyard, that made me uneasy. I forced myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that I was here to relax, to enjoy the solitude, not to let my mind wander into dark places. The feeling didn't go away, though. It lingered. The wind howled louder, and the trees creaked like they were going to fall over. I checked my watch. It was only 10 p.m. I'd only been here for a few hours, but it felt much longer. I got up, walked around the campfire, and stretched. I thought about going to bed early, just to get some rest, but the weirdness in the air kept me from settling down. I finally decided to take a walk through the graveyard, just to get it out of my head. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to point it directly at the stones. Something about the thought of shining a light on those old graves didn't sit right with me. I kept my footsteps light, moving slowly over the uneven ground. The first few graves were cracked and weathered, Some were so old the names had been worn away, the stones half sunken into the earth. I stopped by a small, almost hidden grave at the far end of the cemetery. The stone was tilted, and there was something odd about it. A faint scratch along the surface, something I hadn't noticed before. I crouched down, inspecting it, but my flashlight flickered. I shook it, but the light went out completely. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for new batteries in my bag. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the dirt. It wasn't far away, just on the other side of the graveyard, maybe 100 feet. I froze, holding my breath. The wind had stopped, and the forest had gone unnervingly quiet. There were no animals, no crickets, no owl calls, just the sound of the scraping growing louder. I stood still, my eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the noise. My heart was pounding now, and the feeling of being watched had grown unbearable. It was like I wasn't alone here anymore, like someone or something was nearby. I finally managed to change the batteries in my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark as I looked around. The scraping sound stopped, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. I turned the flashlight toward the edge of the graveyard, where the noise had come from. Nothing. But then my light landed on something unexpected. A figure, a person, standing near the farthest grave, staring at me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out their face, just a silhouette motionless. I stepped back, my heart racing, trying to convince myself I was just seeing things. I had to be. There was no one else here, right? I blinked, and the figure was gone. In the blink of an eye, like they had never been there at all. I quickly walked back to my camp, my pulse racing, every crack of a twig under my foot sending chills down my spine. I couldn't explain what I'd seen or heard. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe someone else was out here playing some kind of prank, but who would do that in the middle of nowhere? I sat by the fire, feeling the cold creeping in, the chill from the ground rising through my feet. The night seemed longer now, the quiet even more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby, just watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, listening to the night, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making my heart race. It wasn't until dawn that I finally dared to close my eyes for a few hours. But even then, the unease didn't leave. I woke up stiff, tired, but I was alive, and that was enough. When I packed up my things the next morning and left, I looked back at the graveyard one last time. It was quiet, as it always had been, but something had changed. The feeling of being watched had never truly left. And as I hiked away, I couldn't help but wonder if it had always been there. If the graveyard, with its broken stones and forgotten names, was never as empty as I thought. I don't know why I decided to camp alone that weekend. It was a dumb idea. I should have at least brought a friend, but I wanted some time to myself. Work had been stressful. My apartment felt suffocating, and I just wanted to get out, breathe in some fresh air, and sit by a fire without hearing sirens or my neighbor's dog barking at all hours of the night. So, on a Friday morning in early October, I packed up my gear and drove out to a remote camping spot in Oregon. It was deep in the forest, far from the usual campsites, but I had found it online from a post written by some backpacker. He mentioned it was peaceful, with no crowds, and that was all I needed to hear. I reached the dirt road that led to the site by noon. It was bumpy, full of potholes, and my truck rattled the whole way. After about 20 minutes, the road ended in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. I parked, grabbed my gear, and hiked in further to find a good spot. I walked for maybe half a mile until I found a small open space between the trees. It wasn't completely flat, but it was good enough. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a fire later. By the time the sun started setting, I had everything ready. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your nose cold but feels refreshing. I sat by the fire, made some instant coffee, and ate a sandwich I had packed. It was perfect, silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. But as I sat there, something felt off. It was that feeling you get when someone's watching you. It made my skin prickle. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. Just darkness beyond the fire's glow. I told myself I was being paranoid. Probably just the isolation getting to me. I wasn't used to being this alone. Usually, even in remote areas, you hear distant voices, a car in the far-off distance, something. But here it was just me. I shook it off, threw another log on the fire, and stretched out my legs. Then I heard it, a stick snapping. It wasn't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees behind me. My heart started beating faster. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. No wind, no animals. Just dead silence. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. But my gut didn't believe it. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of trees and bushes. But I didn't see anything. I kept it there for a while, waiting, but nothing moved. After a few minutes, I turned the flashlight off and took a deep breath. Then, right as I was about to relax, I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees, barely visible in the dim light of the fire. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that it was a park ranger or another camper, but something about the way he stood made me uneasy. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just standing there. I didn't want to make it obvious that I saw him. I forced myself to act normal, keeping my eyes on the fire. My mind raced. What was he doing? Why wasn't he saying anything? Minutes passed. Then, slowly, he stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I felt sick. Every instinct in my body told me to pack up and leave, but it was already late, and hiking back to my truck in the dark wasn't a great option either. I decided I'd keep the fire going all night. I had a knife and a small hatchet with me, so I kept them close. I didn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The wind moving the leaves, the crackling of the fire. It all felt wrong. I kept thinking about the way he stood there, just watching. By dawn, I was exhausted. The fire had burned low, and the woods were quiet. I told myself that maybe it was just some weirdo passing through. Maybe he left. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack when I noticed something. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite. My hands started shaking. He had been here, walking around my tent, watching me. I threw everything into my bag and started hiking back to my truck. Every step, I felt like I was being followed. The feeling got worse the closer I got. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost cried from relief. But as I got closer, I stopped. There, in the dirt near my driver's side door, were more footprints. They led around the truck. Whoever it was had been there, waiting. I unlocked the door, jumped in, and slammed the locks down. My hands fumbled as I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw it into reverse, spun the truck around, and sped down the dirt road, tires kicking up dust. As I reached the paved highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a second, standing at the edge of the trees, I saw him, tall, thin, watching me leave. I never went camping alone again. I was 32 when I drove up to the Wyoming backcountry for a week of hunting. It was early November 2011, and the weather had just started to turn. Cold enough to keep most people inside, but not so bad that I couldn't manage on my own. I'd taken trips like this before, but usually with a buddy or two. This time, I wanted to be alone. No distractions. Just me, the woods, and the hunt. The drive up from Laramie took about 3 hours. I followed the winding back roads until I hit the logging trails, then took those until my truck couldn't go any further. The trail I'd planned to hunt on was remote, deep in the Shoshone National Forest where few people ever went. That was the appeal. The farther you got from people, the better the hunting. And I wasn't after just anything. I wanted elk. I parked on the side of the narrow dirt path, checked my GPS, and started unpacking. My gear was simple but effective. A .308 rifle with a scope, a heavy pack loaded with food, a sleeping bag rated for below zero temperatures, and a sturdy canvas tent. I had a satellite phone in case things went south, but I didn't plan on using it. This was my escape from the world. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and started hiking. The first few hours were peaceful. The sky was a dull gray, and a light dusting of snow covered the ground. I hiked through thick stands of lodgepole pines, their trunks stretching high and straight into the sky, their green needles shaking in the wind. I kept my eyes open for tracks, but the forest was eerily quiet. After about 5 miles, I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick brush. Good cover, easy access to water. I dropped my pack and got to work. First, I set up my tent, driving the stakes deep into the cold earth. Then I gathered wood, deadfall mostly, anything dry enough to burn. I didn't plan on making big fires, just enough to cook and keep warm. I dug a small pit, lined it with stones, and got a fire going as the sun started to set. The forest came alive as dusk settled in. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the long, lonely howl of a wolf. Not close enough to worry about, but close enough to remind me I wasn't alone out here. I ate a quick meal, dehydrated beef stew, washed down with lukewarm coffee from my thermos. Then I climbed into my sleeping bag and listened to the sounds of the forest as I drifted off. I woke up cold. Not the kind of cold where you can roll over and go back to sleep, but the kind that makes your breath feel sharp in your lungs. I checked my watch, 3:12 a.m. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was silent. Too silent. I listened, expecting to hear the wind or the distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. But there was nothing, just heavy, dead silence. Then I heard it. A single, crisp snap of a branch, maybe 30 yards away. I froze. My first thought was a bear, but bears usually made more noise. Elk, maybe? I reached for my rifle, careful not to make a sound, and waited. Nothing. I lay there for another half hour, listening. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a branch falling from a tree, but I kept the rifle close, and when I finally fell back asleep, it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up with the first light and stepped outside. The air was brutally cold, my breath fogging in the early dawn. I stretched, walked around a bit, then stopped cold. There were tracks in the snow. Not elk, not deer, human. They led from the tree line to about 15 feet from my tent, then turned back the way they came. No sign of where they had gone after that. The wind had started to pick up, erasing the trail beyond the clearing. I stood there, staring at them, my mind running through every possibility. Maybe a hiker, but no one should be out here this deep in the woods. Maybe a poacher, but why come all the way to my camp and then leave? A chill crawled up my spine. I took a deep breath, shook it off, and forced myself to think logically. Someone had passed by. That was all. Maybe they'd seen my camp and decided not to bother me. No reason to panic, but I kept my rifle loaded and close. I spent the next 2 days hunting. I moved through the forest slowly, carefully, scanning for elk. I saw plenty of tracks, but they were always old. It was like the animals had moved on before I even got there. That wasn't normal. I had the uneasy feeling I was being watched. Couldn't shake it. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, but I never heard or saw anything. Just the same heavy silence. The only sign that anything was even alive out here were the crows. They circled in the distance, always in the same spot. That meant something was dead. On the third day, I decided to check it out. I hiked toward where I'd seen the crows and found it an hour later. A fresh elk carcass. Its throat was torn open, its ribcage split wide. But it wasn't eaten, not the way a predator would eat. A wolf or a bear would have gorged itself, tearing through the soft parts first. But this kill was different, almost surgical. And the worst part? The tracks around it weren't from an animal. They were boots. Someone had killed this elk, then just left it here. I felt exposed standing there, like I was in the middle of something I shouldn't have seen. My heart started pounding. I turned and hiked back to camp as fast as I could without running. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up by the fire, rifle in my lap, watching the woods. At some point, the fire started dying down, and I went to grab more wood. That's when I heard it. A single footstep. Not an animal. Person. I spun, rifle up, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then, from somewhere out there, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate. I raised my rifle and fired a shot into the dark. The sound shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. Then nothing. Just the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up and got out. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. Just broke camp and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached my truck, I loaded up and got in. But before I could start the engine, I saw something pinned under my windshield wiper. A single piece of paper. Leave. That was it. Just one word, scrawled in dirt. I didn't hesitate. I started the truck, threw it into reverse, and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Just me, the woods, and a week of peace to disconnect from the world. No cell service, no work, just the sound of nature and the occasional crackle of the fire. I figured it would be a nice change of pace, a way to recharge. That was the idea anyway. What happened, though, was something much different. I had chosen a spot in the Ozarks, far off the beaten path. The kind of place that doesn't have marked trails or tourist attractions. Just raw, untamed forest. I parked my truck at the edge of the dirt road, the tires crunching on the gravel, the trees stretching above me like ancient guardians. It was late October, so the air was crisp, the wind carrying that sharp edge of fall. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, and the light made everything look muted, like it was all painted in shades of orange and brown. I had my gear packed: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food. I wasn't one of those hardcore survivalists, but I knew enough to survive a week in the woods. A simple life. I unloaded everything and set up camp just a little ways from the truck. It was peaceful, too peaceful, but I tried not to think too much about it. The sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call kept my mind occupied. I had everything I needed for the night. The fire pit was ready, and as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire, the crackling sound of the wood filling the air. As the evening wore on, the light from the fire flickered and danced, casting shadows on the trees around me. I sat there, alone with the flames, watching them as they shifted and twisted in the wind. It was peaceful, but there was something off, a nagging feeling at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the emptiness of the forest around me. I tried to shake it off. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the area around my camp, and then made sure my food was secured in the truck. I didn't want any animals getting into it. The last thing I needed was a raccoon stealing my peanut butter. The night deepened, the stars coming out in full force above me. It was beautiful and silent, too silent. I heard the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional crack of a branch, but that was it. There weren't any animals around.
No auschutim.
No rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. Just stillness. By the time I decided to crawl into my tent, I couldn't shake the unease. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. I settled into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I kept hearing things. The cracking of branches in the distance. Something moving through the underbrush. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, but the noises persisted. I stayed still, listening. They weren't the usual noises of a forest at night. The wind didn't make the trees creak like that. The rustling didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the quiet, the unnatural silence. Why didn't I hear any animals? Why hadn't I seen a single creature since I arrived? Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent. The air was cold, and the fire had died down to embers. The forest around me was black, the trees towering over me like dark giants. I could barely see past the edge of the camp. I shone the flashlight in every direction, my beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I walked around the camp a little, checking for any signs of movement, but it was all still. The air was unnaturally thick with silence. I walked a little further, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night, but again, nothing. It was just me and the darkness. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A noise, distant but unmistakable. A low, guttural growl came from behind me, from the direction of the truck. I froze, my heart racing. I was trying to stay calm, but every instinct in me screamed to run. That growl wasn't any animal I knew. It wasn't the usual snarl of a coyote or the huff of a bear. This was something else, something wrong. I turned slowly, trying not to make any noise, and shone my flashlight toward the sound. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but it was unmistakable. The growl came again, much closer this time. My hand shook as I raised the beam. My flashlight scanned the edge of the trees. Nothing. But then I saw it, a shadow moving against the tree line. It was big, too big to be any animal I knew. It wasn't just the size, though. There was something wrong about it. Something unnatural in the way it moved, like it didn't belong there. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, praying it wouldn't notice me. But then it did something that made my blood run cold. It stopped. For a moment, everything was still. And then, out of nowhere, it began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I just ran. My feet pounding on the dirt path, the sound of my heart in my ears, the cold air biting at my face. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I ran for what felt like hours, through the dense forest, the trees blurring by me in the dark. The only light was from my flashlight, but it barely cut through the thick shadows of the woods. I don't know how long I ran before I tripped and fell. I landed hard, my hands scraping against the dirt, the flashlight flying out of my hand and skittering off into the darkness. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart still hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything. I was blind in the dark, and that's when I heard it again, the growl much closer this time. It was right there. I pushed myself up, stumbling in the darkness, my mind racing. I had to get back to the truck. That was my only hope. I didn't know what the thing was, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I had to get out of the woods and fast. I kept moving, my legs weak from running, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My flashlight was gone, and the night felt suffocating, pressing in on me from every direction. I kept expecting to feel something reach out from the darkness and grab me, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw the glow of my truck up ahead. It was faint, but it was enough. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my heart lifting with relief. I didn't stop until I was inside the truck, the engine roaring to life as I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires kicked up dirt and gravel as I sped down the road, leaving the woods behind me. I didn't look back. As I drove, I couldn't shake the image of that shadow. The way it moved, it wasn't right, but I didn't care anymore. I was safe. I didn't know what it was or why it had been there, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. I had always wanted to take a break from the chaos of city life, to experience the peace that people always seem to talk about when they went camping. For me, that meant spending a few days in a remote spot in the mountains, far away from any human civilization. The year was 2023, and I was 32 years old. I needed time to reset, clear my head, and just be alone. So, I packed my gear, checked the weather forecast, clear skies, temperatures dropping to a cold 35 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and set out on a solo trip in the dense woods of northern Idaho, a place known for its rugged terrain and quiet beauty. The area was about 30 miles from the nearest town, a small village where most people didn't venture far into the backcountry unless they were seasoned hunters or explorers. I drove my truck as far as the gravel road would take me, leaving behind the paved streets and noise. The trailhead was barely noticeable, a faint dirt path leading into a thick forest of pine trees. I didn't see another vehicle for miles. No other hikers, no signs of life. Just the wind in the trees and the sound of distant birds. Setting off with my pack, the world felt still. The kind of stillness that makes you realize how much noise we constantly have in our everyday lives. With each step deeper into the forest, the hum of modern life faded away. My boots crunched over the dry, pine needle-covered ground, the air crisp and cold, even though it was mid-April. I passed over a small creek, its water clear and cold, running steadily as I made my way up the hill. After a few hours of steady hiking, I arrived at a small, isolated campsite beside a stream, a perfect spot for my tent. The area was relatively flat, sheltered by a ring of pine trees that blocked the worst of the wind. It felt serene, almost like I had stumbled into a hidden corner of the earth. The only signs of other humans were some old, half-rotted fire pits scattered around the area, the remains of people who'd visited long before me. I set up camp, getting the tent out and staking it down on the uneven ground. The sun was beginning to dip low behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. I built a fire, the crackling flames warming the cool evening air, and cooked some instant ramen in a pot I'd brought along. The smell of the noodles filled the space around me, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. Night fell quickly, as it does in the mountains. The stars above were breathtaking, the kind of clear, bright sky that feels almost unreal. The moon was only a thin sliver, but it still illuminated the landscape in a soft, ethereal light. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, and the sound of the stream rushing nearby was like a lullaby. I sat for a while, staring into the flames, lost in my thoughts. I wasn't scared. I was too tired, too content in my solitude. But then, as the night deepened and the forest grew quieter, something shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the stillness began to feel unnatural. The wind had died down completely. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. The only noise was the crackling of my fire. I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods were quiet. That's normal. But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around the darkened forest, but all I could see was the vague outline of the trees, their tall trunks rising like shadowy sentinels. I threw more wood onto the fire, trying to distract myself, but the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't that I heard anything. It was just a presence, a sense that there was something or someone out there. A brief rustle from the forest caught my attention, but when I stood and looked, there was nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't like it. Still, I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal moving around. I went to bed shortly after, sliding into my sleeping bag and zipping up the tent. The fire outside had burned low, and I could hear the wind picking up again, whispering through the trees. I fell asleep quickly, exhaustion taking over. I woke up in the middle of the night, my sleep disturbed by a noise, a soft crack, like a branch snapping. I lay still, trying to ignore it. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. I rolled over, tugging the sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to block out the cold. But then came another sound. This time it was louder. A snap of a twig followed by the faintest shuffle of footsteps in the dirt. My heart started racing. I froze, my breathing shallow as I strained my ears. The noise wasn't far away, just outside the tent. Someone or something was moving around, just on the other side of the thin fabric. The air in the tent felt thick, and I fought the urge to grab my flashlight or my knife. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. Then the noise stopped. Complete silence followed. The kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides, heavy and suffocating. I waited, my body tense, listening. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I thought it might give me away. But after what felt like an eternity, the silence was broken by something else. A soft whisper, not from a person, but more like the wind passing through the trees. A rustle, and then, as if it had never been there, the feeling of being watched slowly faded. The next morning, I emerged from my tent, tired but determined to continue my hike. Whatever it had been, I thought it was likely just an animal. I packed up my gear and began moving further into the forest, heading toward a small lake I had read about on the map. The day was clear and cold, the sun shining through the canopy above. It felt better, somehow, to be walking again, the rhythmic sound of my boots on the forest floor calming my nerves. But the deeper I went, the more I began to feel like something wasn't right. The trail grew less defined, and the trees seemed to crowd in closer, blocking out more of the sunlight. The air smelled thicker, more earthy, like the scent of old leaves and damp wood. I passed a few small animal tracks along the way. Deer, maybe a bear or two, though I didn't see any signs of fresh activity. By the time I reached the lake, it was late afternoon. The water was still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. It was beautiful in a quiet, eerie sort of way. There was something unsettling about the perfect calmness of the place. I decided to set up camp here for the night. As I started the fire, the same feeling from the night before crept back in. I glanced over my shoulder often, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But the area around me was deserted. Still, it was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I cooked my dinner in silence, trying to focus on the fire, but the crackling embers did little to ease the tension that had settled in my chest. The forest felt heavier now, and the sense of being watched was more intense than ever. It was late by the time I crawled into my tent, the fire outside burning low. That night, the noises came again. Soft steps. Something or someone was circling my camp. This time, I didn't wait for it to stop. I grabbed my flashlight and quickly unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkened woods. Nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes darting around, every little noise making me jump. The feeling of being watched was constant now, an oppressive weight that I couldn't shake. By morning, I was drained. I decided to pack up and leave. There was no point in staying any longer. The peaceful, serene camping trip I had envisioned had turned into a nightmare of constant unease. The hike back to my truck was long and tense, my mind racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in around me. My nerves were shot, and when I finally saw my truck in the distance, I almost ran toward it. I drove back home that day, the sound of my tires on the road a relief compared to the silence of the forest. Even now, weeks later, I still can't explain what happened out there. Was it an animal? Person? Something else? I don't know. What I do know is that I won't be going back to those woods. Whatever it was, it left me with a deep sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't right in that place. The forest, the lake, the stillness, all of it. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't safe. And now, whenever I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers of the wind through the trees. And I know deep down I'll never forget the feeling of being watched.